After being reborn, I made sure to avoid every single encounter with Ryan Sullivan this time. He was reassigned to the Southern Military District, while I applied to Northwestern University. He submitted our marriage application, but I secretly took it back. He purchased a marital home over there, yet I deliberately chose to settle in the North. All of this was because in my past life, his white moonlight, Olivia Carter, had remained single for him her entire life. He felt indebted to her, so behind my back, he secretly adopted a child with her. Even as he grew old, my own son and I were eventually moved by their so-called touching love story. And in the end, we all became one big family. The moment I took back the marriage application, I finally let out a sigh of relief. No one knew that I had been reborn. At the very last moment before the application was officially submitted, I rushed over and retrieved it, using the excuse that there was an error in the family information. The clerk looked at me with confusion. "You submitted this application this morning, and now you're taking it back in the afternoon? Are you calling off the wedding?" Not wanting to create unnecessary trouble, I simply shook my head. There was a mistake in the information. I'll correct it and bring it back. Only then did the clerk relax and tell me to resubmit it once I had fixed the error. I nodded, walked out, and immediately tossed the marriage application into the trash. In this lifetime, Ryan Sullivan and I would never get married. In my past life, although he had submitted the marriage application, his attitude toward me became colder and colder. I thought that was just his personality and didn't think much of it. I never imagined that it wasn't until I was on my deathbed that I would finally learn the truth. He had always had Olivia Carter by his side. She was his white moonlight, his true love. She had never married, waiting for him all her life. And in the year Ryan turned 40, he was finally moved by her devotion and adopted a daughter with her. Even my own son was touched by their so-called pure love and secretly kept in contact with them behind my back. If not for my son accidentally letting it slip while I was dying, saying that now his father and Olivia had finally made it through all the hardships, I would have remained in the dark forever. It was only then that I realized my entire life had been a joke. So that was why Ryan had always been so distant. That was why he was constantly being reassigned. Every single transfer was arranged so that we would be as far apart as possible. We were married for 60 years, but if I counted the actual days we spent together, it probably wouldn't even add up to 1 year. When I nearly died giving birth, he wasn't there. When our child fell sick in the middle of the night, I carried him through the pouring rain for 3 hours before I found a doctor. Even when both of our parents passed away, he was still nowhere to be found. But on the other hand, wherever he went, Olivia Carter was always by his side. She started out as an ordinary nurse and eventually became his personal doctor. Ryan felt indebted to her for her unwavering devotion, so he silently accepted the fact that they adopted a child together. He also silently accepted the fact that her child called him Dad. Even my own son wished for my death, just so that these two star-crossed lovers could finally be together. When I returned home, I looked at the old, worn-out house, my expression complicated. In my past life, in just 1 month, Ryan and I had gotten married here. After our wedding, he was reassigned to the Southern Military District. I wanted to go with him, but he said the conditions there were too harsh and persuaded me to stay behind. And so, I ended up living here for 30 years. What I didn't know at the time was that less than 6 months after Ryan's transfer, Olivia Carter also moved there. From that moment on, the two of them became entangled in each other's lives for the rest of their days. The most ridiculous part? I used to worry that he had no one to take care of him while he was away. I had wanted to be by his side. But every single time he rejected me, and every single time he gave me the same excuse. Our parents and our child need someone to be with them. And so, while he had his soulmate accompanying him wherever he went, I spent my entire life trapped by him. Back in this small, confined world, I returned home, but Ryan Sullivan had yet to come back. As soon as I entered the house, I went straight to my room and pulled open the bottommost drawer, where I found my acceptance letter. In my past life, because Ryan was reassigned to the Southern Military District right after our marriage, and because my mother-in-law suddenly fainted for no apparent reason a month later. Combined with the fact that I had just become pregnant, I gave up my opportunity to attend Northwestern University. That regret had stayed with me my entire life. I ran my fingers over the acceptance letter, staring at my name and the bright red school seal printed on it, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I remembered how, in my past life, when I was already on my deathbed, Olivia Carter had come to see me with my son. As if she already knew I wouldn't last much longer, she started visiting me daily. But when no one else was around, the kind and gentle expression she usually wore was stripped away, revealing her true face. The words she spoke stabbed straight into my heart. So what if your father held the title of wife? The one who was by Ryan's side all these years was me. You were nothing more than a tool to bear his child, and a free caretaker for the elders. I should really thank you for giving me such a wonderful son. She rambled on, while the most pathetic part was that I no longer even had the strength to curse her. I had to watch as my own son treated her like his real mother, the two of them playing out a perfect picture of maternal love and filial piety before my eyes. Even when I was finally at the point of complete despair, my son let out a sigh of relief and said, "Olivia has finally made it through all these years." I shook my head, carefully putting away my acceptance letter. The past was irreversible. While preparing dinner, Ryan finally returned home, looking utterly exhausted. His clothes were damp, and at that moment, a sudden realization hit me. On this very day in my past life, I had been overjoyed because I knew Ryan had submitted our marriage application. To celebrate, I had gone out and bought a variety of ingredients, eagerly waiting for him to come home so we could celebrate together. But I had waited, and he only returned very late, drenched from head to toe. At the time, I had been worried and asked him what had happened, but Ryan had simply responded indifferently, refusing to say a word. Later, I learned the truth. Olivia Carter had somehow fallen into the river, and it was Ryan who had saved her. Thinking back on it now, I could already guess what had really happened. Olivia must have found out that Ryan had submitted the marriage application that day, and in her despair, she had either lost hope or tried to use her life to force his hand. That would explain why Ryan had been so cold to me that night in my past life. He must have blamed Olivia's near drowning on me. But how was I at fault? He was the one who had proposed marriage. He was the one who had filled out the application. He was the one who had promised to stay with me for life. And yet, in the end, it was as if I had become the villain who broke up a pair of lovers. So when I saw Ryan once again coming home completely soaked, I merely averted my gaze. Unlike my past self who had fussed over him and hurried to prepare hot water, this time, I calmly continued cooking. Without hot water, Ryan could only silently change into dry clothes. During dinner, he sneezed a few times, but I acted as if I hadn't heard. After the meal, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen, I noticed Ryan pacing anxiously in the living room. He seemed restless, as if struggling with something, and in the end, he finally grabbed his coat, muttering, "I'm going out for a bit," before hurriedly leaving. I pressed my lips together. Turning to the old, yellowed poster on the wall, I carefully wrote down a line. "Once I complete 2 tally marks, I will leave this place." Ryan didn't return until almost dawn. From the next room, I could hear the way he deliberately lightened his footsteps. I pretended not to notice. The next morning, I assumed he had already gone to work. I was about to head out to buy a train ticket when I suddenly heard coughing from his room. My hand, which had been holding my breakfast, paused for a moment, but I quickly ignored it and continued eating. After finishing my meal, I prepared to leave. Train tickets were difficult to get at this time of year, and the lines for them were always excruciatingly long. But that ticket was too important to me. I had to secure it as soon as possible so I could finally feel at ease. Just as I was about to step out the door, I heard a knock. Frowning in confusion, I opened it, only to find Olivia Carter standing outside. She looked pale, her hair sparse, her skin an unhealthy yellow from malnutrition. Her frame was so thin she looked as if a gust of wind could knock her over. In my past life, I had only ever seen Olivia Carter when she was old. I still remembered that moment. I was lying on my hospital bed, frail and exhausted from a lifetime of suffering, while she sat elegantly at my bedside. Her long, jet-black hair was neatly combed, her expensive clothes and designer handbag showcasing the life of luxury she led. Draped in a cashmere shawl, she looked as refined as ever, a stark contrast to my worn-out, gray-haired self. Olivia didn't dare meet my eyes. She merely stole a quick glance at me before lowering her head uneasily, her voice timid and weak as she mumbled, I came to find Ryan." Anyone who saw her at that moment would have immediately assumed there was something improper between her and Ryan Sullivan. But I had no time to entertain her act. I didn't even bother shutting the door as I brushed past her and went downstairs. Taking some money with me, I rode my bicycle out. Relying on memory, I asked around at several places, and after much effort, I finally arrived at the train station close to 10 in the morning. Since it was the holiday season, the station was bustling with people, and the ticket lines stretched endlessly. I chose a queue that seemed slightly shorter and waited patiently. It wasn't until almost noon, just before the office closed for lunch, that it was finally my turn. However, by then, all the seated tickets to my destination were already sold out. Without hesitation, I pulled out my money and bought the earliest available standing ticket instead. Carefully, I tucked the ticket close to my body before pedaling my way back home. On my way back, I mentally prepared myself for the possibility of walking into a scene where those two star-crossed lovers were pouring their hearts out to each other. But when I pushed the door open, I found Ryan sitting in the living room. His bedroom door was also wide open, almost as if he had done it on purpose. When he saw me return, he parted his lips as if he wanted to say something, but I turned away and headed straight into the kitchen. I was hungry. It was time to cook lunch. During the meal, I could sense that Ryan wanted to explain something, but since I remained silent, he hesitated and eventually swallowed his words. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, he lifted his head and called my name. Lena. I focused on my bowl of rice and said flatly, "Don't talk while eating." Ryan was caught off guard, his words stuck in his throat. I sneered inwardly. In our past life, I had always been the one chattering away whenever we were together, deliberately trying to engage him in conversation. But his response was always the same. Either he barely reacted, or he would simply say, "Don't talk while eating." Back then, I had felt ashamed, thinking I lacked proper etiquette. But later, I finally understood. When you're with the wrong person, no matter what you say, you'll always be in the wrong. I no longer cared what Ryan had wanted to say. After finishing my meal, I went back to my room. Inside, the decorations I had carefully put up after our engagement were still there. Red paper cuttings, window flowers, festive bedding. I gathered everything, piling it onto my bed. Looking at these items, which I had once chosen so joyfully while dreaming of a happy future, I silently found a large bag and packed them all away. My cousin's wedding was at the end of the year, and my uncle's family wasn't well off. Since these things had cost a good amount of money, it would be a shame to throw them away. I decided I would take them over to her tomorrow. Just then, there was a knock at the door. My hands paused as I was packing. "Lena, about that jewelry. Can we buy it another day? A friend of mine needs the money urgently." Ryan's voice came from outside. Jewelry? I was momentarily stunned before I recalled that, in my past life, Ryan had once mentioned taking me out to buy some accessories around this time. I had been so excited that I spent the whole day at home waiting for him, but in the end, he never came back. And of course, no jewelry was ever bought. Expressionless, I merely responded with a faint and continued packing my things. It didn't matter what I said, he wasn't going to come home anyway. After a moment of silence outside the door, I finally heard his footsteps retreating. I continued sorting through my belongings. I hadn't lived here for long, so I didn't own much. Most of my things fit into a single suitcase. What troubled me more were the clothes I rarely wore. When I had first moved in, I had thought that since our wedding was approaching, I might as well bring a large portion of my wardrobe over. Now, looking back, I realized how foolish I had been. I had no choice but to find another large bag, neatly folding and bundling the clothes together. I would send them back home first, before making any further decisions. When I went downstairs, I saw that Ryan Sullivan had already taken the bicycle. Left with no other option, I struggled to carry the heavy bag of clothes on my shoulder and walked for over half an hour before finally reaching home. When my mom saw me, she immediately assumed that I had gotten into a fight with Ryan. To avoid any unnecessary trouble and to ensure that nothing would interfere with my plans to attend college, I had no choice but to temporarily hide the truth. I simply told her that I needed to buy new clothes over the next few days and had no space to store these, so I was bringing them back for now. Only then did my mom breathe a sigh of relief. Otherwise, if she found out I was planning to break off my engagement with Ryan, she would probably chase me down 3 streets with a knife. Yes, chase me with a knife. My parents and Ryan's parents worked at the same state-owned company, so he and I had practically grown up together. But Ryan had always been the kind of child that other parents admired: top grades as a student, an outstanding career as an adult, and good looks that made him one of the most desirable men in our social circle. My mom had always liked Ryan, and when someone once tried to introduce me to another potential match, Ryan's parents quickly intervened. They clapped their hands together and decided that Ryan and I were a perfect fit. At first, I thought someone like Ryan, with his good looks and promising future, would never take a liking to me. But a few days later, my mom came home beaming with excitement, telling me that Ryan actually had feelings for me too. That was when I started getting to know him. Over the next 6 months, our relationship progressed rapidly. A month ago, our families finalized our engagement. I still remembered how my mom had told me, "A son-in-law like Ryan is a once-in-a-lifetime find. You hit the jackpot, Lena. You better hold on to him tightly, or else I'll make you regret it." To be honest, when I first got together with Ryan, I was dazed, almost in disbelief. I had never imagined I could become his wife. Occasionally, I had noticed him spacing out when he was with me, but I had assumed it was because he was busy with work. It had never occurred to me that even before we were married, he had already been torn between me and Olivia Carter. Maybe he chose me because I was the more suitable option, or maybe it was because both of our families had already decided on us. Now, the only thing left between us was that marriage application. Back then, because I was preparing for my college entrance exams, Ryan had asked me to move in early so he could take care of me. But now that I had taken back the marriage application, our relationship had naturally reached its end. Leaving my family home, I felt unusually light, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a while, I had the leisure to take my time. I stopped by a street vendor and bought an ice pop, strolling along at a relaxed pace. At this time, many street vendors were discreetly setting up stalls, selling goods under the guise of private transactions. I knew that in this era, these inconspicuous vendors were the first generation of self-made millionaires. Unfortunately, I had to focus on my studies and could only watch enviously as they paved the way to their future wealth. As I neared home, a sudden scene caught my attention: a man and a woman standing together. "Ryan, no, I can't accept this." Olivia's voice trembled, carrying a hint of suppressed sobs. She sounded incredibly pitiful. Ryan was holding his bicycle with one hand, while forcefully stuffing a wad of cash into Olivia's hands with the other. "Just take it. This money would be wasted on unnecessary expenses if I kept it, but for you, it can cover your living costs for half a year. It's better used this way." They were still pushing the money back and forth when Olivia suddenly noticed me. Her face turned pale with shock, and she instinctively stepped in front of Ryan as if shielding him. "There's really nothing going on between us. Don't misunderstand. I was the one shamelessly clinging to him. If you want to blame someone, blame me." The girl in front of me, with her sickly yellow complexion, had an air of fragile determination, as if she were ready to sacrifice herself for some great cause. But she didn't see the man she was so desperately protecting, Ryan Sullivan, standing behind her, his face ashen as he stared at me in shock. I adjusted the bracelet I had just bought and walked right past them without sparing them a single glance. What terrible luck. Even a simple walk had to be ruined by running into people I didn't want to see. Not long after I returned home, Ryan followed, pushing the door open and stepping inside. For the first time, there was something different in his expression when he looked at me, as if he finally had something to say. "Lena, let me explain," I looked at Ryan Sullivan indifferently. "All right, go ahead." But the truth was, no matter what he said, I wouldn't care. Still, when he saw that I wasn't furious and seemed willing to communicate, he subconsciously let out a breath of relief. "I knew you wouldn't overthink things," he said. I sneered inwardly. He seemed to take a moment to organize his thoughts before speaking in a sincere tone. "Things aren't the way they looked." I watched him silently, making no effort to respond. "There was a time when I got injured," he continued. "On my way to the hospital, I ran into her. She helped me bandage the wound and accompanied me to get treatment." He hesitated for a second before glancing at me cautiously and adding, "After that, every time I went to the hospital to change my bandages, I happened to run into her. Coincidentally, she was a student of my mentor, so I figured I could help her practice a little." Too many coincidences added together were no longer coincidences. They were intentional. I refused to believe that Ryan, as a grown man, wouldn't understand what was really going on. He was just pretending not to see it. So spending that money on jewelry for me would have been a waste, but giving it to her for living expenses was more meaningful, I said, my tone neutral, but my words sharp. Ryan's expression stiffened, looking slightly embarrassed. "That's not what I meant." Whether that was what he meant or not, it didn't matter to me. The result was the same. I thought for a moment before speaking earnestly. "Have you ever considered that we could just call off the engagement?" I couldn't help but bring it up. If he was the one to suggest breaking it off, at least my mom wouldn't cry, scream, and threaten to end her life over it. Besides, in our past life, he had grown increasingly distant from me after submitting the marriage application. He probably regretted it back then, too. If we could end it now, it would be a relief for both of us. But to my surprise, Ryan's brows furrowed sharply at my words. "Marriage isn't a game. You can't just say you don't want to get married and call it off." His tone was serious. "Lena, that kind of thinking is irresponsible." All right, I get it," I interrupted, raising my hands in surrender. I had no desire to argue with him any further. Without another word, I turned and went back to my room. Rather than waste my time listening to his lectures, I'd rather focus on something productive, like figuring out which stock I should invest in to make a fortune. As for money, I would have to use the funds my parents had given me for the wedding. Because they were so pleased with Ryan, my parents had nearly emptied their life savings to support our marriage. In my past life, they had given me all the dowry money from Ryan's family and even bought a lot of household appliances and furniture for us. Fortunately, I had yet to spend most of that money this time around. I opened my suitcase and carefully took out the dowry money from Ryan's family, wrapping it securely in another cloth. As for the money my parents had given me, I put it away safely. There was no way I could return it now. I'd just consider it my startup capital. If my mom threw a fit about the engagement, I would simply put the money in front of her. Hopefully, the sight of it would be enough to keep her from getting too angry. The next morning, the first thing I did was mark another tally on the old poster on the wall. 8 more days. In just 8 more days, I would be able to leave this place. "What are you writing?" A low voice suddenly sounded from behind me, startling me. I turned around abruptly, only to see Ryan standing behind me, looking at me with confusion. He frowned slightly. "What are you writing on the newspaper?" He was standing very close, his head tilted slightly downward. His breath brushed against the back of my ear as he spoke, making me involuntarily shiver. I quickly stepped away, feeling an inexplicable sense of discomfort. Disgusting. I had originally wanted to brush him off, but seeing that he was still staring at the newspaper stubbornly, I had no choice but to make up an excuse. "I'm counting how many days it's been since you submitted the marriage application," I said casually. For some reason, my words seemed to please him. The confusion and unease on his face faded slightly. Ryan Sullivan exhaled slightly, lowering the hand he had been holding behind his back. In it was a small, square velvet box. "Open it and take a look," he said, watching me expectantly. I found it strange. In my past life, we had been married for 50 years. We had raised our son together, buried 4 elders, and yet he had never once bought me any jewelry. My gaze fell on the velvet box, and for some reason, I found the whole situation ironic. "What's wrong? Just open it," Ryan urged again. I took a deep breath and pushed the box back toward him. "Take it back," I said calmly. "Give it to me on the day the marriage application gets approved." Of course, in this lifetime, that day would never come. The corners of my lips lifted in a slight smirk. Ryan looked at the box in his hand and sighed. "All right, I'll put it away for now. I'll give it to you once the application is approved." I had to admit I could see the disappointment in his expression. After all, he had carefully prepared a gift, only to have the recipient refuse to even look at it. That would sting anyone's pride. But so what? Compared to the lies he had told me and the harm he had caused in my past life, this was nothing. After breakfast, Ryan prepared to leave for the day. Just before stepping out, he told me he would come home early in the evening to take me to the movies. I didn't say yes or no, I simply watched as he walked out the door. As soon as he was gone, I moved the packed bags I had prepared yesterday out of my room and left a note in the living room, saying I was going to my uncle's house for a few days. By the time I took the bus and arrived at the neighboring town, it was already noon. My uncle and aunt hadn't expected me. When they saw me walk in with a large bundle, they quickly put down their bowls and chopsticks to greet me. My grandmother, upon seeing me, immediately pulled me into a tight hug, refusing to let go. Seeing her again, knowing how early she had passed in my previous life, filled me with warmth. My grandmother only had 2 children, and out of all her grandchildren, she had always doted on me the most. I had come not only to bring back all the wedding items I had packed, but also to bring her a variety of health supplements. We chatted for a while before my uncle quietly went off to catch a chicken for dinner. Knowing I couldn't stop him, I let him do as he pleased. When my aunt saw the bundle I had brought, she was puzzled, even a little alarmed. She probably thought I was running away from something. But when I finally untied it and she saw what was inside, she was so stunned she couldn't speak for a long time. Grinning, I turned to the group of people who were still staring in shock. "My mom asked me to bring these back. If you want to thank someone, thank her. After all, once I left, I'd have to face my mother's wrath anyway." What was one more debt on my conscience? I reassured myself with that thought, though I still felt a bit guilty. Hearing that it was my mom who had sent the items, they finally relaxed. Even so, my aunt still seemed uneasy. "But this is a lot." My grandmother, however, had no such reservations. She waved a hand dismissively. "What's the big deal? She's my granddaughter. If she's getting married, of course, we should give her a proper dowry. Take it, take it." Then, she turned to my uncle and aunt with a teasing smile. "And when Arlena gets married, you two better prepare an even bigger dowry for her." My uncle and aunt laughed, nodding in agreement. Staying at my grandmother's house was a rare relief. At night, I shared a bed with my cousin, whispering to each other long into the night. During the day, I indulged in the delicious meals my grandmother prepared just for me. Neither my uncle nor aunt had stable jobs. My aunt made a living selling roasted sweet potatoes near the factory entrance, while my uncle mostly worked odd jobs. One day, while helping my aunt at her street stall, I noticed that the vendor next to us, who sold hair accessories, seemed to be doing much better in terms of business. I curiously asked my aunt why she didn't sell those instead. She simply shook her head and sighed. "I don't have a supplier for those. And even if I did, it'd take a lot of money to buy inventory. Plus, I'd constantly have to watch out for officials chasing street vendors away." I kept my thoughts to myself, but made a mental note. In my past life, my uncle and aunt had lived a hard life, struggling every day just to get by. They had gone gray early from years of hardship, but they had always treated me well. This time, if I could help them, I would. Helping them escape poverty, perhaps even become wealthy, wasn't impossible. After understanding my aunt's hesitation, I began casually mentioning, in passing, how profitable setting up a stall could be. Every day, I would talk about how much money street vendors made. Eventually, my aunt started paying more attention to the neighboring stalls, unconsciously observing their business. After a few days, she even started asking me whether selling other goods might be more profitable than roasted sweet potatoes. I knew she was tempted. Now, I just needed to wait for the right opportunity. Once I secured a good supplier, she wouldn't resist the idea anymore. I stayed at my grandmother's house for an entire week on purpose. After all, once I left for college, meeting them again wouldn't be easy. During my stay, I frequently bought small items from the vendor next door, subtly prying for information. Eventually, I managed to get the name of their supplier. Together with my aunt and cousin, we went to buy a batch of goods and tested selling them for 2 days. Only after making sure they could get started did I feel comfortable leaving. When I got home, I unpacked the things I had brought back from my grandmother's house and then collapsed onto my bed. By the time I woke up, it was already dark outside. As soon as I stepped out of my room, the rich aroma of freshly cooked food filled the air. I was about to speak when I noticed something in the kitchen, 2 figures laughing and chatting. A soft, feminine voice carried through the air. Leaning against the door frame, I crossed my arms and watched the scene unfold. Just as Olivia Carter emerged from the kitchen, carrying a plate, she caught sight of me standing there. With a sharp gasp, she shrieked, and the plate slipped from her hands, crashing to the floor. Ryan Sullivan rushed out of the kitchen in a panic. But when his eyes met mine, his face instantly turned pale. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Finally, I spoke. "Do you two need me to step out so you can continue your cozy dinner?" Ryan seemed to snap out of his daze and instinctively took a step back. "Lena, you're back?" Olivia bit her lip, looking at Ryan with teary eyes before turning to me with an expression of reluctant grievance. I found it amusing. "What, do I need your permission to come home now?" As soon as the words left my mouth, Olivia staggered back 2 steps. Tears streamed down her face as if they cost her nothing, and her lips trembled. "Lena, you know that's not what I meant." Before I could reply, Ryan's brows furrowed in frustration. "Lena, what are you saying? Olivia is just a student here, with no one to take care of her, and since you weren't home, I thought I'd invite her over for dinner. Don't make a fuss over nothing." I glanced at the man standing protectively in front of Olivia without hesitation. Without a second thought, I slapped him across the face. Ryan froze, stunned. He had clearly never expected me to lay a hand on him. Beyond him, I saw Olivia's lips curl into a faint smirk, her expression carrying a hint of provocation. I let out a cold laugh. Under their gazes, I strode to the table, picked up a pen, and firmly drew the last missing strokes on the tally marks I had been keeping. 2 more days, just 2 more days, and I would finally be free of these 2 revolting people. After Olivia left, Ryan stared at the marks on the newspaper, finding them strangely unsettling. Though he couldn't explain why, something about them felt off. He turned to me. "Lena?" Expressionless, I met his gaze. Ryan hesitated before speaking. "Olivia and I, there's nothing between us." I had no interest in listening. Picking up my chopsticks, I silently continued my meal. Seeing that I clearly wasn't willing to talk, Ryan fell into silence as well. After dinner, as I was organizing the things I had brought back from my grandmother's house, Ryan suddenly spoke up. "By the way, Lena, why does your room look so empty?" He frowned slightly. "Didn't you have a lot of wedding decorations and preparations?" When I didn't respond, a strange look flickered across his face, and for the first time, he seemed vaguely anxious. I was thinking, since our marriage application has already been submitted, we should start decorating the house properly. I saw that you already bought window decorations and stickers before. Bring them to me, and I'll start putting them up. I scoffed. If you want to put them up, go get them from my cousin's place. But to avoid unnecessary arguments with him, I simply said, "It's still early. Let's talk about it in a few days." Thinking that I had let the matter go, Ryan Sullivan visibly relaxed. The next morning, I was surprised to find that he had made breakfast. After eating, he didn't leave right away. I ignored him and instead picked up the pen from the table, carefully adding another tally mark. Finally, one last day left. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., I would be able to leave this place for good. Ryan saw me marking the tally and chuckled. "Don't worry, the marriage application should be approved soon." I didn't even glance at him. Instead, I started clearing the dishes. "Why haven't you left yet?" I asked. Ryan smiled at me. "Since we're getting married soon, I thought I'd take you shopping for some new clothes." I paused for a moment. His words reminded me, I was about to leave for college. I should buy a few new outfits to start fresh. I went back to my room to get some money. Seeing that I didn't refuse, Ryan let out another small sigh of relief. But in the end, we never bought the clothes. Because the moment we stepped out the door, we saw Olivia Carter leaning against the wall, looking as if she had been waiting there all night. Ryan's face paled as he rushed over and gently nudged her. Olivia slowly opened her eyes, and when she saw the two of us together, her expression changed. She instinctively stood up and looked at me. "Lena, I'm sorry. Yesterday Before she could finish, her eyes fluttered shut, and she collapsed directly into Ryan's arms. Ryan's expression shifted instantly. "Olivia?" He caught her and shook her anxiously. I squatted down without a word and pressed my fingers hard against the philtrum point beneath Olivia's nose. She trembled slightly, but forced herself not to wake up. I had to admire her dedication. Seeing that I was about to press again, Ryan hesitated, then quickly pulled Olivia away from my hand. "She's severely malnourished and anemic. I'll take her to the hospital." Without looking back, he carried her and rushed out the door. I calmly shut the door behind him and slowly followed after them. At the hospital, I watched as Ryan stood anxiously by Olivia's bedside after the doctor left. When I walked over, he stiffened, then frowned. "Why are you here?" he asked. I looked at Olivia carefully. She wasn't actually that good-looking. Her malnutrition made her appear frail, and her high cheekbones gave her a somewhat sharp, harsh look. Then I looked at Ryan. Maybe this was just his type. Sensing my gaze, Ryan avoided my eyes. I finally spoke, my tone indifferent. "The day you submitted the marriage application, she jumped into the river." The impact of my words was immediate. Olivia's body on the bed trembled violently, and Ryan instinctively shot to his feet. The chair behind him toppled over with a loud crash. He opened his mouth to say something, but I continued, my voice steady. "You used the money meant for my jewelry to help her. When it was for me, you called it a waste, but when it was for her, it was enough to support her for 6 months." Ryan tried to say something, but I raised my hand, stopping him. "It doesn't matter anymore." I glanced at Olivia before speaking again. "While I was away, you brought her into our home. You let her cross that threshold." Ryan opened his mouth, but I lifted my hand again, signaling him to stop. Then I turned to look at the bed. "You knew she was faking it. So, are you planning to stay here with her for the night?" I didn't believe for a second that Ryan Sullivan, as a soldier, couldn't tell that Olivia Carter was faking it. This was nothing more than a willing act between the two of them. "If you don't want to get married, you can call off the engagement. But you won't drag me down with you." I looked at the two of them with indifference. Hearing the words, "call off the engagement," Ryan finally panicked. "No, I won't break off the engagement." I glanced at Olivia on the bed. Even at this moment, she was still able to keep up the act. Her endurance was impressive, though if she didn't have that level of patience, she wouldn't have won Ryan over in our past life. Ryan continued speaking, his voice anxious. "I was just trying to help her. She has no family, no one to rely on. She barely has money for food, so I thought I could lend a hand. We're all comrades, we should look out for each other." His voice was slightly raised, as if trying to convince himself. I saw the tears welling in Olivia's eyes and trickling down her face. I let out a mocking chuckle and shook my head. "Do whatever you want. I'm leaving." As I reached the door, Ryan's voice sounded from behind me. "Go on ahead. I'll be back soon." Of course, I didn't take his words seriously. Instead, I went out and bought 2 new outfits, then deliberately waited for my parents to get off work so we could go to a state-run restaurant and have a proper meal together. It wasn't until late in the evening that I finally returned home. By then, everything I needed to pack had already been sorted. Anything I wanted to give away had already been sent off. Ryan, however, had not returned. It was well past 11 p.m. when I sealed the letter I had written, reporting Olivia Carter to her school. Consider it a little token of appreciation for all the sleepless nights she spent pretending to care for me in my past life. As for Ryan, out of respect for our parents, I would let things go. But the engagement, that had to end. I wrote everything down, all the entanglements between him and Olivia over the past few weeks, and that very night, I went out to drop the letter into the mailbox. by tomorrow or the day after, my mother would receive it. The next morning, after freshening up, I stood before the old poster one last time and carefully added the final stroke to my tally. Then, with my bag packed, I left without looking back. On the train, it took me half a day before I finally managed to get a seat. Watching the bustling platform and the countless travelers coming and going, I knew that each of them was about to embark on a new journey. And so was I. Ryan's perspective. After Lena left, just like that, Lena disappeared from my life. All of her belongings were gone. She hadn't left behind a single word for me. Or rather, if she had, the only thing she left behind was those tally marks on the old poster. It was only now that I realized those weren't marks counting the days since I submitted the marriage application. They were counting down the days until she left. Later, I learned that she had retrieved the marriage application as soon as I had submitted it. Even the dowry money my family had given was neatly placed back in the drawer. 3 days later, our parents came to discuss the engagement, and it was only then that I finally understood Lena had never accepted Olivia. But why couldn't she give me one last chance? Lena had said that Olivia was faking her illness. Of course, I knew that. That was why I had already decided that once she recovered and was discharged, I would cut off all contact with her. I wouldn't let her come between Lena and me again. But I never expected that Lena wouldn't even give me the chance to prove it. She left without hesitation. I begged her parents not to break off the engagement. I swore I would make Lena change her mind, but her parents merely shook their heads, looking at me with disappointment before walking away. I sat numbly in the room where Lena once lived. She had once been here, filling this space with her presence. Instinctively, I opened the cabinet where she had kept her bedding, only to find it empty. It was then that I finally understood. She had been planning her departure for a long time. I had just been too blind to see it. Sometime later, Olivia suddenly showed up at my door, her face pale. I was reported. Olivia Carter was expelled from school. She stood before me, her face pale, pleading desperately. "Ryan, can you help me, just for now? Can you let me stay with you for a while?" I silently pushed her away. How could I? Lena was gone because of her. If I had anything to do with Olivia now, then for the rest of my life I would never have another chance with Lena. Olivia refused to accept it. She knew that Lena had left, so she started clinging to me, trying to stay in my life. But soon after, I was transferred. Lena was no longer here, and there was no reason for me to stay either. I still remembered when I was young, my parents once took me to visit a family. A little girl had clung to me the entire time, following me around, listening eagerly to my stories, laughing as she threw herself into my arms. Years later, when our families started discussing marriage proposals, I hadn't been particularly interested. But when I heard her name, I agreed without hesitation, as if fate had taken control of my decision. We started dating, and everything went smoothly. She became my fiancée, but now all of that had turned into nothing. After being transferred to the Southern Military District, I wrote to her, but she never replied. Once, I secretly went to see her. She had grown taller. Her hair was longer. She was even more beautiful than before. She had friends by her side, people she laughed and talked with, but I didn't dare let her see me. That was when I realized my entire life had been a joke. I secretly bought a house, thinking that if she ever forgave me, I would propose to her immediately. I waited for a long time, clutching a bouquet of roses as I hurried to see her. But when I arrived, someone else was already standing by her side. Later, I heard that after graduating college, she got married and had a daughter. Then I heard that she made a fortune in the stock market. And then, I spent the rest of my life alone. On my deathbed, I suddenly saw a different version of my life. I saw myself marrying Lena. I saw us having our own children. But then I saw Olivia Carter again. I saw my middle-aged self finally give in to her persistence, allowing her to adopt a child, allowing that child to call me Dad, and ultimately allowing her to stay by my side. Wait, what else did I see? I saw Olivia standing beside Lena's hospital bed, saying those disgusting words. I reached out, trying to stop her, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't change anything. A sharp beeping sound filled the air, growing louder and louder. I suddenly jolted awake, my mind reeling. The first thing I saw was Lena walking out of the office. a piece of paper in her hand. Before I could process what was happening, I watched as she casually tossed the paper into the trash can. A sharp pain shot through my chest. I ran after her. I had to catch up. I had to change everything. The beeping sound continued to ring in my ears.